So hello, welcome everybody to the Global Classroom. This is on week 2. My name is Patrick Paul Walsh. I'm actually a Chair of International Development Studies in University College Dublin, and I'm visiting Columbia University on sabbatical for a year, working with the UN SDSN team in the Art Institute. I'm also chair of what's called the Academic Steering Group of the Global Association of Masters Development Practice. So first of all, I'd like to welcome people here in Columbia in the room, but also a big welcome to everybody around the world, but particularly to my class in Dublin, Connor and that group there. Okay. So today, just to look at the plan of the lecture, so all I can really do is, try to get across just a kind of a simple roadmap to the way we should think of the key issues around inequality, both between nations and within nations. So what I'm going to start off with is first to think about issues to do with documenting maybe the global state of inequality between nations, and then to maybe start just thinking of the measurement issues around that, how we measure it, document it, and maybe a kind of a simple theory or framework the way we should really think about the issues behind inequality across nations, right? And in particular, I will zone in on issues around the global partnerships. The second thing I'll do then is that then I'll start to work with looking at inequality within nations, and I will have a different type of framework there to think about that. When I come out of, initially I'll be talking only about income inequality, but then what I'll want to do is, in the spirit of the Human Development Project, obviously what I want to do is to start thinking about not just, say, income inequalities, but maybe how that translates into health and education inequalities, etc. And then also we might even think about the future, not just a Human Development Index, we might be thinking of some sort of Sustainable Development Index, how maybe we incorporate inequalities in vulnerability to environmental issues, etc. Right? So just not to be too focused on income inequality. What's guiding me in this lecture is this the Open Working Group in the UN's policy document that came out in July, and in particular Goal 10. They have a goal about dealing to reduce both global and between nation and within nation income inequality, and they have a kind of a number of targets, basically implicit instruments to deal with inequality across nations and within nations. And in a lot of ways, my thinking in terms of the documentation and the theory is very just to address, in a broad sense, what they're addressing. And at the end, we look at their recommendations and we see whether there's something missing or there's gaps or there's something that is quite not clear about that. Okay. The other thing to watch out for is that the SDSN itself has a paper on the proposed Sustainable Development Goals, which is building on Rio 20+. And within that, it doesn't actually have an explicit goal on inequality. And its argument would be is that all the goals, which are more individually focused, deal with underlying roots of inequality, and that you don't really need an overarching goal for inequality because it's actually built into all the other goals. Okay, and that's something that we'll think about at the end as well, whether this is the right thing to do. Should we have a standalone goal for inequality, or should we be looking at saying, well, actually, this is a composite of the other goals. Okay, so this is something we can talk about at the end. Okay. In terms of slide 2, this might look like a complicated slide, but for me, this says a lot about what I would call the structural inequality that exists between, say, the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. Okay, so this is data built on 2000, which would be the year that the Millennium Development Project basically started. And at the top, basically, you have, from here to here, you have the poorest to the richest countries in terms of income per capita per person in PP dollars and constant prices. And here we have a distribution of the percentage of the population who live in these incomes. And obviously what we see is that the OECD, let's say the top billion people, so we always talk about, at the beginning of the Millennium Development Project, it was always extreme poverty was 1 in 6. This is what we used to talk about, right? It was always about the bottom billion. The thing that interests me is actually the top billion. right? The OECD countries, right? Because here what we see is the top billion people are able to command the majority of the world's income, right? And what we're going to see, we'll have a framework for thinking about income. So we have to say, well, given that the top billion don't really own the land or the population or all the raw materials, how is it that they appropriate most of the return and value added income from global production? How is this possible? And what's interesting is that this top billion, this graph, even though we will see that inequality between nations is tending to be dropping over the Millennium Development Project, not we'll see within individuals, but within nations because of the BRICS, this structural feature is still present coming into the post-2015 agenda. Why? Because now we have the OECD represents the 1 in 7. So we still have 1 billion people in poverty, which is like the 1 in 7, but we still have the billion people in the OECD who are still commanding the majority of the world's wealth and income. Another thing in looking at this graph, because we're looking at the entire distribution of population and income, there is an issue out there when we're thinking about inequality, is that people who work on this idea of, say, let's define extreme poverty as $1 a day PPP constant prices in dollars, and that more or less brings you to about 1 billion people a year. What's remarkable is how sensitive that threshold is, because what can happen when you're looking at $1 a day, by just making it $1.25 or even $2 a day, you can, even $3, $4 a day, you can bring nearly half of the world into extreme poverty, right? So there's huge sensitivity in terms of choosing those thresholds in terms of headcounts. The issue that is not as well known is the work that I was pointing out. This is a paper I've given you with Murphy and Walsh. This is the idea of dynamics of poverty. And rather than just looking at the percentage of people who are living on $1 a day or $2 a day, is to get into what we call dynamics of poverty or transitions. Because in reality, you have 5.9 billion people on the planet who have no social protection or access to social protection, very vulnerable to health shocks, environmental shocks, other types of shocks. And what's amazing is that when you look at poverty data and you look at the duration, you notice that a lot of people in extreme poverty are only there for short durations. What that means is there's an awful lot of inflowing and outflowing and transitions between, if you like, $2 a day to less than $1 a day. And that is interesting, right? Because again, who are the poor? And what we can see is that there's transitions in and out of poverty all the time, and there's an awful lot of turbulence down this end of the distribution, right, that you wouldn't see at the other end in, say, OECD countries. And we have to be aware of that. So when we're thinking about lifting people, putting them up the income distributions, reducing the difference between low incomes and medium and high incomes, we've got to be very aware that there's an awful lot of transitions between different income groups going on all the time, and our policy cannot be just targeted at what we think is one defined group, but it has to be a policy that deals with dynamics, that deals with vulnerability, resilience, as well as getting people out of poverty. Right? So we'll come back to that point. Okay. Just to look at the current state of, just to get a sense of, some people don't want to look at income inequality. They like to, this stage, they like to look at what we call wealth inequalities, or the issue with assets. Okay, so we can easily look at income per capita, like GDP per capita in PPP dollars for each nation, and we can do, I'll show you, we can look at different measures like a Gini index or some sort of coefficient of variation. And I'd say when we're looking at that, even though, yes, the OECD is still in the majority because of the rise of the BRICS, particularly China and India, anything that incorporates that is tending to show that inequality across nations is declining over time, right? But believe me, give me different data, different indices, different weightings, different measures, I can show you it's going up. But generally speaking, we'll say it's going down, right? But one thing that people are zoning in on is to get out of this issue of looking at inequality across nations, but looking at actually wealth of individuals, right? Because this has become a kind of a very contentious point across the world. So income is around, I'm making this up, $77 trillion in PPP a year, right? In terms of wealth, so what is wealth? Wealth is actually quite difficult to calculate, because what you got to do in a household, for example, like what is your wealth? You'd have to look at what your assets are, the value of your house, the value of your car, you know, to really put a value on what you are worth. So if I really had to sell everything I own, how much money could I generate today? That's the idea of what your wealth is, okay? And the wealth in the world is about $200 trillion, and we see again the dominance of the OECD countries, North America, Europe, Asia Pacific, and a little bit the contribution of the BRICS coming in, India, Latin America, China. They're coming in a little bit in latter years, but there's no doubt that not only are the OECD countries appropriating the income, they are accumulating the wealth as well. Okay. This is a figure about individual inequality. The bottom line about here, I think on slide 5, is a fraction, 0.5% of, say, the world's adults have basically 35% of the world's wealth. Okay, so that is actually tremendous. Or another way of looking at it is the top 10% have about 80% of the world's wealth. Okay, so even though people are looking at this issue of inequality across nations, just looking at the wealth of nations in terms of GDP per capita, there are others who are extremely concerned about the concentration of wealth into a small amount of people, right? And this is a different issue altogether, right? This is the issue that Thomas Piketty talks about, that other people talk, you know, remuneration of top managers, like the very wealthy. How can global society and the global economy generate such a concentration of money into so few people, right? What is wrong with our institutions that allow that to happen? How can that be corrected, etc.? And that is a different issue, right? But it is related to the idea of, and in that metric, there has been very aggressive growing of inequality across individuals, right? Particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, you actually see an even bigger consolidation of the wealth going into a smaller amount of people, right? And it's another way of analyzing it, which is different to wealth across nations. It's wealth across individuals, which is a different thing altogether. Just, I might go back to, so people can see me, rather than looking at the next few slides. I just talk through them, you can get them later. The next issue, what I just want to say is, rather, that we could spend a whole class going through how to measure inequality. What are the data requirements, the issues, you know, index number problems, etc. It's a big area, and it's an interesting area, because to be honest with you, like I said previously, if you're a consultant or somebody's telling you, we want to show that globalization has actually reduced global inequality, you know, give me the data, the right weightings, the right sort of index, I will be able to show you whatever you want, right? Do you want it to go up or down or remain the same? And that is a problem. But the measure that seems to survive the test of time a bit in terms of inequality is what we call the Gini index. Okay, I think the popularity comes from the even though the index itself is a little bit difficult to calculate, because compared to, let's say, a standard coefficient of variation, which would just look, you take the mean or median income of a country, and then you might look at the deviation from that mean of the richest countries and the poorest countries, and you'd create a coefficient or a standard deviation or coefficient of variation. What the Gini index does, it actually looks at the absolute difference between incomes of every pairwise income levels of every country on that distribution if you were going across nations, right? So that's interesting, because it doesn't just look at the tail, the lower end or the upper end, or look at gravitation to the means. It actually takes the whole run so basically it takes into account not just the first, second, third moments, so in other words, mean variances, kurtosis, or whatever. You know, you actually, the nature of the distribution influences the Gini. The other thing is that it's nicely graphed into a what we call a Lorenz curve. And just to give you an idea what the Lorenz curve is, let's say this is, you can imagine this for the world, this could be for the world, but let's say this is Brazil. And what you do is look, you look at the cumulative share of the population. So this would be say, the bottom 20% in terms of the income profile, what sort of percentage of income do they command? So the bottom 20% here command 2% of accumulation of income. The bottom 40%, they account for 7%. Here, the bottom 80% are 35. So that means that the top 20% are clearly commanding 65% of the income that's generated in Brazil, for example. Right? So the thing about the Lorenz curve is that this line is perfect equality. So as the Lorenz curve bows into this, the right-hand side here, this actually shows increasing inequality. And this, the Gini index itself is bounded between 0 and 0. So this is quite nice. People seem to like to say, well, give me a figure or a score, right? So what is the size of the earthquake on a Richter scale of 1 to 10? What is the Human Development Index on a scale of 1 to 10? What is inequality in terms of 0 to 1 or 1 to 100? And this is what the Gini index gives you, right? But what it actually measures is this, the area between the actual Lorenz curve and the line of perfect equality, right? So people are very quickly able to just look at the Gini coefficient or look at a Lorenz curve, and they would know very quickly the scale of inequality in a country or not. Okay. I have a few graphs. This graph here is just to show you that I can take something like the coefficient of variation and the Gini, and I can look at a 10-year period within countries, and I can show you inequality is going different directions depending on the index that you're using. So that's just to put out a warning that there's probably at least 10 measures of inequality out there that you can get in statistical packages like Stata. Gini is the most popular one, but what you'll see, what's remarkable, if you look at the trends of inequality that come from these indexes, they can all go different directions because they are, as index numbers, they're just calculated differently, and you have to understand the biases that are generated. The other trick that you've got to be very worried about is that certainly, let's say, taking a simple one like comparing wealth of nations, how do you actually construct a Gini index? Well, some people would give every country an equal weighting. Some people would actually weight it by population size. They'd say, no, you know, it's not fair that China would just be one of 200 countries. Maybe it should, you know, because of its 1.2 billion people, that should have that weighting, etc. Right? So depending on whether you weight or unweight the data, depending on the index you use, like coefficient of variation or Gini, you can generate different results. But this kind of gets even more sophisticated within countries, because even when you look at household data and sampling and the sort of implicit weights of stratified samples, etc., you'll realize that this can radically change whether, say, Tanzania's inequality is growing or decreasing over time between urban and rural areas, between city, you know, etc. Right? So you've got to be very aware of your data, what it is, the aggregation, what sort of weights are you aggregating over households or regions or nations, and you've also got to be aware of the index that you're using and the properties of that index, what sort of biases it creates, etc. Okay, because you can generate, in a structural sense, whether there's high or low inequality is not the issue. Where it really becomes problematic is when you look, say, at a trend where you want to see whether it's declining, what we call the first moment or the difference, whether it's changing over time or not, is it going or up or downward direction. That's when, on the margin, it becomes a very important issue. In general, what do we know about the Gini coefficient? What I would say is that the world generally seems to have if you look at inequality across nations or GDP per capita, just a straight Gini, it's normally in the region of 0.6 or 0.7. And that's quite high. That's saying that there's actually quite big differences between the highest income countries in the world and the lowest. There's a huge variance there, right? Generating that on a big distribution. Mostly, if you look at, say, regional, which is here from the UNDP, or even within country, within regions, broad regions, or within country, the Gini is much lower, right? The only one that can look aggressive would be the relative incomes, say, inside sub-Saharan Africa. If you compare the richest and the poorest, that can go up to 0.7. But generally speaking, you know, it's actually countries like Brazil, South Africa, etc., that are up there in terms of the Gini. But even, say, the United States, China, etc., they would have quite high Gini's as well, it'd be 0.4, 0.5, etc. Okay. So what I want to do, there was just some warning signs about, you know, do we know the state of inequality? Can we measure it? Can we look at the dynamics? That's an exercise for you, but that's just a very fast tour about the state of global inequality across nations and the issues around measurement. What I want to do is to try and give you a little bit of we have to kind of understand what's generating that inequality if we are to address it. And particularly if we're setting goals and targets, like our way of looking at or the way we think generates inequality is going to be important. Okay? So for example, I'm going to do what I call a very supply side, a production side theory of what I think is generating inequality across nations. Okay? So just to give you a sense of, this comes from Amartya Sen's. Right? So obviously his book is all about what we call freedoms, and particularly socioeconomic, political, legal freedoms of individuals, and how this empowers people, right? And what surprised me is that when he came to Dublin, he gave an address because he got an honorary doctorate. He actually put up this graph, right? And what he looked at is that, here I want to look at explaining the differences of GDP per head across nations. Like, what are the key indicators? What would you always look at? And of course, you know, I thought he was going to say, well, the sort of legislative or anti-discriminatory practices. I thought he'd come into the social freedoms, but no, he said the indicator that tells him everything is how much manufacturing there is in industrial in output, right? Or more importantly, how much sort of exporting of manufactured goods there are. That will tell you how good a society is. And of course, we looked at him to go, that's a very economic variable, right? To look at export-led growth, high value added in manufacturing. But he turned to us and he said, well, what you've got to understand is that what is your theory of capital formation? What is your theory of investment, right? So how do you think you move from an agrarian society, right, up into agribusiness, up into industry, up into services? How do you get exporting? How do you get your exports out? How do you get into high value markets? And then he emphasizes to us is that you've got to think of the investment climate and what's that made up of. So you do have to have educated and healthy people with those sort of freedoms. You do have to have good governance and good political institutions and good legal frameworks. All of those things feed into basically an investment climate where people can invest with certainty and get return, etc. Right? So normally, he goes, when you actually see high value added in manufacturing and exporting and manufacturing, it's normally associated with low mortality rates, with high levels of education, with gender empowerment, with access to water, electricity, etc. So all of these things go into one, right? And that's what's important, right? So in a sense, for those, if you think of looking at why nations do well, or how come some nations be wealthy and sustain their wealth over other nations, there are people who emphasize economic factors. There are those who emphasize social factors like Zen, freedoms. There's others like Acemoglu who emphasize the power of political institutions and these sort of things, right? So, but going back to Habermas, this is the political theorist, he goes, what's important is the goal triangle, in the sense that what's ever happening is that your economic, political, and social structures have to be working together and intertwined and helping each other, right? That's how it works, okay? But a lot of this literature, to me, still doesn't explain why the OECD is able to appropriate such high income. I'll just go back so people can see me. It doesn't explain why the OECD appropriates such high income and such wealth, right? Because, you know, yes, I understand there's weaknesses in social structures, let's say in Africa, there's weaknesses in political institutions. I understand the investment environments, but still though, I mean, part of me thinks that if I own that mineral, cobalt, wherever it is, to make mobile phones, surely I could extract a huge amount of wealth for Africa for that. Surely I could do that, right? So there's something in this story that's missing. And what we put forward is this idea. My background's industrial economics, and I've looked at industrial organization theory. And one thing that's emphasized a bit there is innovation. So obviously, when I look at the factor production approach, I look at the inputs of land, of raw materials, of capital, physical capital, labor, etc. And I can say, well, what is the big advantage of the Northern Hemisphere? The big advantage is what we call the residual, the solar residual, or the total factor productivity, or this measure of productivity, or R&D, you could think of it, right? Or innovation, right? But so what is this residual innovation? Is that somehow certain countries, when they take the inputs of the world, are able to produce an output that everybody wants, that has high quality and people will pay a high price for. But, you know, what does this mean? Well, what it means is that what you've got to realize is that in a lot of theories of industrial organization, there is not country-specific innovation, but there is what's called product-specific innovation, right? Now, product-specific innovation just means that there is something that is scarce, that is hard to put together, that is quite mobile, and can generate quite a lot of value added for you, okay? So what is kind of happening in the world? Let's say take the pharmaceutical industry, okay? So you'd say to the guys who run the pharma industries, you go, okay, well, where's your market? Like, there's 7 billion people out there, what drugs are you looking at? And they'll tell you they're probably looking at certain types of drugs. So they say, well, our market has to be, it's in the OECD, it's where the money is, and the taste in the OECD, the age structure is different. The people who are generating the most income or demand for drugs are old people. So lo and behold, our whole R&D program is based on drugs for old people in the OECD, and that's where they're putting their innovation and money. And then you go, well, just isn't there cheaper drugs you can make for children in the developing world? I mean, why would that not be your focus? And they would say, well, that's not where the money is, that's not where the taste and structures are. They do their R&D and innovation, which actually comes through a lot of universities' labs, which comes through the national funding programs, and they focus then their innovation on that issue and not on important global issues, right? That has a lot of R&D, it's got a lot of product-specific knowledge, a lot of target group, etc., right? Then when you look at how they're bringing in the raw materials for this, using the globe's sort of raw materials and labor force, etc., how they put it together and bring it to the markets, you realize there isn't really a lot of institutions governing or looking at what they're doing. There is no global antitrust authority. There is nobody looking at the structure of their distribution, the structure of the retail markets. So as a result, when you kind of look at appropriation, when you look at countries exporting and what their value added they're getting, what money they're getting, versus these intermediates and then these companies, what you see is they appropriate most of the rent, which is basically attributed to companies that are coming out of the OECD. Okay, so it's something in sort of food markets, it's in health, etc. We've got to start thinking about, you know, when you look at inequality across nations, it's based on GDP data. That is the value of goods and services coming out of companies in each country, right? Why is it that the companies who are registered with certain countries are appropriating the high value added? How can they do that? You know, what is their comparative advantage, right? Is it really just based on local political, social, economic structures, or is there something else? Is there something in the global structures, lack of regulation, lack of institutions, the way they're able to manipulate the inputs to create these high value outputs and then dominate world markets in their particular product? Okay? And I think that is the way to answer the question, is what is the advantage of the Northern Hemisphere? And to me, to do that, of course, to do high-value products, you do need to be located in countries that have smart people, healthy people, good infrastructure, water, good sports by government, sure. But you also have to be able to do this product innovation. And I've seen this in Ireland in the sense that we host all the headquarters for the social media, for the pharma industry, for the medical, for the food, and you see the specialist knowledge that's needed to actually create those products and to dominate world markets with those products, right? So this is not, when people say, well, what is your innovation? What is your innovation or your residual or your total factor productivity? To me, this is to do with a lot of product and company specific knowledge and not necessarily at a nation state. It's to do with those sort of product lines, right? Could be wrong, but it's something to think about. Okay, so I'm just talking about product-specific innovation. So it's not really, if you slip into an old sort of trade theorist about thinking, well, who has the comparative advantage in land or labor costs or in terms of raw materials, who should be on top of the world, that's going to be very different to when you start thinking about these innovation quality spaces, or product-specific innovations, who is on top of the world, because it's how you put them together, and the knowledge of how you put them together is important, right? Right? So everybody wants a mobile phone, but can everybody take the raw materials that are needed to make a mobile phone and put it together? That's the issue. And where would you do that? Okay. Now I want to look at, change the pace. I want to just look at inequality within nations. Again, I'm going to take what I call a factor of production approach to explaining inequality. It's actually a little bit Marxian, but it's okay. I think it's a simple way to do it. And now, rather than thinking about inequality across nations or the value, goods and services generated by companies across nations, rather than looking at inequality of GDP per capita and PPP dollars in constant prices, what I want to do is to go inside countries and look at what we call as income inequality, normally within households. And normally we use household surveys to document inequality within nations, right? We don't use company data, we use household data. It's different, okay? So even the way you think about inequality across nations, which uses basically company data, because it's GDP per capita, now we switch into household. And the thing we got to think about is, just because there's a lot of production and value added and exporting going on out of a country does not mean that the local population is appropriating the rents or appropriating the returns. And how would you do this? Well, the way to think about it is that output in a country is produced by labor, land, capital, raw materials, etc. Okay? So in terms of how do households generate income, what you've got to look at, what's their access and what sort of income are they generating through ownership or access to the factors of production, right? So one is a job. Obviously, one way to get some sort of income is to actually have access to a job and to get a wage, okay? You would be surprised with the restrictive practices in terms of getting access to jobs, okay? So one is like, even to get a job in the civil service, what you need, okay? So the sort of civil service exams, the structures around that, it's like getting a job in the European Commission. Like, what do you have to do to get a job there, right? It's not that straightforward, right? But even in the old days, Ireland was notorious for having restrictive practice. The one I like is the grocery market, right? So obviously handling food is very important, because obviously you could poison people. And not everybody should be allowed to handle food, because food is something that, you know, is important to people. And so there had to be a license. Only an upstanding person could have the license to run a grocery market or a grocery shop, right? And that license would be handed down through generation. And that would mean that only certain people in that nation could be working in the restricted practice around, say, groceries. Similar idea, we even have it today in Ireland, is this thing about only certain general practitioners or doctors are allowed to deal with medical cards, right? So these are people who basically have social insurance, and the government paid for their medicines and for their doctor visits. But only only a restricted amount of doctors have the right to actually deal with patients with medical cards. Again, a restricted practice around who can survive in that business and who can't. The same with pharmaceuticals, etc. Right? But even in the developing world, when you look very closely, particularly at what you call some sort of formal employment, there's all sorts of restrictions about urban versus rural workers, who has the right to work in certain areas, etc. So there are restricted practices. In this basic idea of I want to work and get a wage rate, you'd be surprised that it's not easy to do that, right? Rents, land is notorious. Property rights over land, who has the right to rent land, appropriate rents from land. Again, this is a very thorny issue, okay? So a lot of people look back at Ireland's economic miracle, how we came from famine to riches, back to rags, but we came to riches. And people always say the Land Commission. How do we transfer the land from 4,000 landlords to basically 6,000 middle-income farmers? That was the trick to do that, right, at the beginning of our independence, okay? Again, there seems to be a lot of reluctance to actually take an asset like land, to find property rights over, share it amongst the population, or try to redistribute it. In some ways, people just never get a handle on it at all, in the sense they don't find the property right, and it creates all sort of issues for productivity of farming, formations of cartel or cooperatives, all these sort of things. The other issue is who is entitled to set up companies, who gets dividends from companies. A and this is a very important one for investment. If you're an entrepreneur with money or you want to invest, you have to be more or less sure you can appropriate the return on your investment, and that the government just doesn't take it on you, or etc. Right? So in a normal society, like when I say Holland, everybody's middle income. So everybody seems to have a waged income, get money from property, get money from dividends. They all seem to have a fairly standard income distribution, and in the end, each household seems to get a similar level of income. Right? If you have a concentration of ownership of people into those who get, say, formal jobs, those who get ownership of land, those who own the companies, if that is a constant, like if only a small proportion of your population have access or are entitled to have ownership of the factors of production, that will build in a structural inequality in your society. There is just no doubt. So you can look at concentration of ownership of land, concentration of ownership of companies, concentration to formal jobs, etc. And you will see the countries that, when you spread the population across these factors of production, if they don't have access or they don't own the factors of production, you will get inequality in that society. And to be fair, people within the Open Working Group, we'll come back to this, are very focused on access and freedoms. They call about the social, the economic, and political freedoms, about being able to own assets, get returns to assets, sell assets, etc. And this is what they mean. Assets meaning land, capital, raw materials, stuff like that. Okay. So moving down the topics, just to go back here again. Okay. So hopefully we have a little bit of a theoretical framework around, I know it's a very what's called production function approach to explaining inequality across nations or GDP differences, and now I'm using a very production function approach to understanding how households appropriate income from assets. And so if there's production going on in society, how are they grabbing some of that value added in terms of labor rent, in terms of leasing out land, renting land, getting dividends from capital, owning the companies, selling the raw materials, etc. That's how the rent from the companies is being dispersed into the households and into generating inequality. Okay. And so if we're looking at how to reduce inequality within nation, or between households, or between nations, maybe we can see whether the targets and the goals are addressing any of the issues around that I brought up just purely on the production side. Okay. The other popular thing that people look at is the Kuznets curve. Okay, so this is a Harvard, I think he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, right? In the 50s, he basically came up with this sort of stylized fact. Economists are always great at graphing an endogenous variable or an outcome variable against an outcome variable, which maybe can be explained by 300 simultaneous factors, but it doesn't matter. It seems to be a stylized fact, and it seems to be one that your theory or what you're addressing is consistent with. And one is this idea of, as you develop economically, right, inequality seems to, as you say, go from, say, low income to medium income to high income. What happens is that inequality tends to rise and then fall, right? And this seems to be a stylized fact across nations. And even if you go within country and you go across regions and you look at, say, the GDP per capita of a particular region within Tanzania, and you look at the relationship between GDP per capita and then inequality, what you'll actually see is the country is going up its different stages of economic development. It's first, it actually, as it moves, say, to a middle income country, inequality actually goes up, and then it goes to a high income, inequality comes down. And what explains this? Okay. There's different theories, right? The most kind of obvious ones is that, as you develop, let's say one sort of feature that does happen is you move from an agrarian society to a more agribusiness industrial society. So that does mean that you have a percentage of your population working in more high-valued industries compared to, say, lower-valued industries. And it would be even a labor market that pays people's marginal productivity, you would expect some high-wage people to coexist with low-wage people because they work in industry jobs or public sector jobs versus, say, agricultural jobs, right? So as you industrialize, what you see is that you don't just move to it's you gradually make a transition from agrarian society into more what's called diversified jobs structures. Okay? And as you do that, you just naturally create more inequality. The other thing that happens is like in that process, there's another process where there's urbanization is taking place, where people are moving out of the countryside into the cities. And again, that process seems to be identified with inequalities. Okay? So the other thing you could look at is government capacity, that as you develop economically, maybe you're building your bureaucratic structures, you're getting maybe democracy's taken root, bureaucratic structure, you're bringing in a bit more tax revenue. Basically, you're able to, when you actually start to see inequalities arising, it's only at a certain threshold that you can really have the tax capacity to address these inequalities by using these sort of instruments. Okay. So one thing I didn't say, going back to, I just want to go back to, because it's important, is that here I'm looking at one line of thinking is this whole idea of here are the assets in a country, who's appropriating the returns from these assets, how are people distributed across the ownership of these and the returns. But one thing about assets is that they are not that stable either. So when you're in a world that has environmental shocks, so a recent World Bank report has a nice framework for thinking about this. When you're in a world that has environmental shocks or health shocks, and it's a world where you really don't have insurance or social protection, what can happen is that there can be quite a lot of asset destruction, right? So one thing when Amartya Sen talks about, like, when do people become, say, vulnerable to famine, right? When do they have, and the two big factors he'd say is asset loss or endowment loss. So when you have a lot of asset destruction, right? And then, so that just means that your ability to have a return from your, if you lose your asset or your assets destroyed, your ability to generate an income is very problematic. On the other side, of course, he teams it up with some sort of commodity price booms, etc., where basically the price of food or your real income is dropping very aggressively against you as well. But he emphasizes the asset destruction, right? So what are your two choices in terms of actually, and we'll come back to this in the policy debate, what's your two choices to deal with, say, this type of inequality coming from assets? Well, the first one is, like, if you're like South Africa coming out of apartheid and you just make a decision that you are not going to redistribute assets, you're just going to keep the initial asset, as skewed as it is, we're not going to go there. We're not going to reallocate assets. But what you do is you focus on social programs. So you say, what we want to do is to make sure that households and individuals, through education, through public goods, through transfer programs, are basically, able to educate themselves, get a good job, to save, buy property, buy land, and over time, it takes time though, it can take 10, 20 years, over time inequality will readdress itself. Because if individuals are empowered, even though you start from an initial disadvantage, intergenerationally you will readdress this if you have the right public goods and transfer structures. Okay? And that's one way to do it. Okay? And this is the way that seems to be in our open working groups recommendations. But there are other more aggressive ways to start thinking about this. One is to look at, they're not looking at issues of vulnerability of assets, right? So how is it that people, let's say in the OECD, how do we protect our assets? Okay, so when we invest in our shares, or when we basically own property, or we have a job, or we have, how do we deal with health shocks? How do we deal with environmental shocks? How do we deal, we basically have insurance markets, and people have different. So this is a paper that you look at by Murphy and Walsh, what we wrote, and what we're looking at is that when you have inequality, people have an asset distribution, incomes coming from that, but there is risk. There's risk associated with each asset. People have different preferences and willing to pay to insure against that risk. And of course that can be put into a national fund where those, who basically with different probabilities of being exposed to different risks, when their event happens, then what happens that they get a transfer, right, paid for by people on this event hasn't happened to them. Okay, so another way to look at, a more dynamic way to look at asset and asset loss is to say, well, actually, there's a lot of people moving in and out of poverty and in and out of assets to create the sort. Like, how are we able to protect the assets, make them less vulnerable to shocks? How can people be more resilient to all these sort of shocks? Will this keep assets up, incomes up, and then will that allow us to tax and redistribute easier, etc.? right? So this is another issue that I want to come back to. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me just talk through this issue of, a lot of what I've talked about here is income generation and income inequality. There's a lot of people, a lot of people will look at this whole idea of defining well-being in terms of income, GDP per capita, as very problematic. Also in terms of inequality, they feel this is problematic. And the whole spirit of the human development movement, obviously, was to not look at purely things in terms of an economic view or an income point of view, but to look at outcomes, social outcomes in particular, such as health and education outcomes. Okay, and there is an interesting, I'll show you a graph in a second, that there is something quite interesting that when you look at the relationship between an economic indicator like GDP per capita and social indicators like life expectancy or child mortality or education indicators, like to just ask a question, even within Europe or across the world or within Africa, like what is the relationship between social and economic development, right? And part of that, is that related to inequality or not, okay? And the way it turns out is that I've had a few PhDs in Tanzania getting a human development index for a household using the household survey, and they've come up with kind of interesting things where what seems to be happening is that those who basically are on higher incomes seem to be able to appropriate a much higher health and education outcome. And the explanation that they give is that when you come into an urban area and you're working in a good job, you're able to lobby government, get much better public goods. So you basically have the good schools, access to hospitals, insurance, pension schemes, and that seems to be all wrapped around in that group of people. So even though their income is not that much higher than those in the countryside, their health and their education return can be really much higher. So basically the challenge is that what I'd say to you, if you had a household survey, look at the income inequalities, but then I would suggest that the health and the education inequalities are even higher, right? Because of the access to public goods and insurance of the richer compared to the poor in these countries, right? Okay, and this kind of stands up in the sense that, generally speaking, what you see is that I have an example here on the slide that I take from Ray. This is just an example. So here is a country. So there hasn't been a lot of work done on microdata on households at inequalities within regions or countries, looking at health, education inequalities, and income inequalities. But just gives you a little bit of a taste what it might look like, because the Human Development Index, after all, is just the average income in a country versus the average, say, life expectancy and the average education achievement. Okay, so it's not, it doesn't look at inequalities, but yet you kind of understand that certain countries with very high income have very low social outcomes, and then there's others with relatively low incomes that seem to have high social outcomes. And you ask yourself, well, how is this possible? And obviously you start thinking about the role of government, the capacity of that government, its policies on redistribution, its policies on asset dispersion across the population. You start saying, well, you know, is this a more, so to give an example, here is Guatemala, which is theoretically a higher income country in terms of its per capita income and PPP, purchasing power parity. Just to say that index, the PPP index in dollars, PPP comes from an Irish statistician called Roy Geary, just in case you didn't know that. But sometimes, like in the early days of UNDP, they would have said the Geary index, and then over time, it's just people forget the people who actually invented it. But the share, this is just looking at the share of the poorest people, the share in income of the richest people. So Guatemala is clearly a society with a lot of income inequality. Sri Lanka is a country that has a little bit less inequality, but it is a poorer country, right? So this is a situation where we're looking at countries in terms of their GDP per capita, and then we ask, well, what would we expect in terms of the social outcomes, particularly life expectancy on average and education on average? What would we expect? Okay? But one indicator, and people do HDI corrected indices for inequality, is what you actually see is Guatemala which has higher income but higher inequality, has lower life expectancy, much higher infant mortality rates, and much lower adult literacy rates. So in other words, it seems to be that, irrespective of your economic development, when the social indicators seem to be higher, when it's clear that the income distribution inside these societies is better. A better income distribution is a sign that there's something about that society or its governance that's basically giving more access and ownership of assets and returns to assets and more redistributive, and as a result, the social outcomes seem to be better. Okay, this should be tested a bit more aggressively, but there you go. This is just to show you in terms of GDP per capita and graphing it against, say, something like, I don't know why that didn't come out. This is the education index of human development on this side, and it is surprising that, for similar levels of income, the sort of literacy rates and enrollment rates are just so dramatically different, right? So in former sort of Soviet Union countries or dictatorships or things like that, it seems to be that, the average literacy rate or the average school enrollment rate is just much higher for the same level of income, right? So it seems to be that one of the things you don't talk about in Human Development Index, obviously, is governance, or exactly the role of the government, big or small government. Is it redistributive? What's it doing in terms of access to assets, etc.? But it seems to be quite important. If you want a relationship between economic development and social development, you've got to understand, well, the conductor of that. So Sweden clearly has both moving together with big economic growth rates. Others have big economic growth rates when they're moving in the opposite direction. Right? And you have to make up your mind on that. The other thing is, one thing the Human Development Index is not doing, in the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals, this is the idea of now, when we have economic development, not only do we want good social outcomes, but we want environmental sustainability. In other words, we have to care for water, air, and quality of land, etc. Right? And this is a big challenge, right? And clearly, what's kind of interesting is that in the old days, there was a big debate between why are we using the HDI at all? Because Ravelon, there's a lot of guys said, look, a good economist understands that you have in economics, general equilibrium structure, you've got households, you've got companies, you've got the role of government. So if you've got good governance, healthy, educated households, good schools and infrastructure, etc., good companies, that will generate good GDP per capita, right? And it was true that in a lot of middle to high income countries, they generally would have very good social outcomes. It was only from middle income down that you start to see disconnects between social and economic development. And that was kind of nice for the OECD DAC and for the donors, because it was the developing world had the problem, not us. What's interesting about any environmental indicator in terms of access to renewable energies or CO2 emissions, it's actually the high income, particularly the United States and others, who are disastrous at any measure of that. So if that is incorporated into a Human Development Index, right, particularly the one that takes these cubic roots, in other words, if you do bad in the environmental index, it will actually bring your score right down, irrespective of how you're doing on your economic or your social. It will actually bring you right down the league tables. Okay? So that's a kind of a sign that when it comes to sustainability, is actually the northern hemisphere has a lot of work to do not the southern hemisphere. And that index will actually, if you were to incorporate something like I'm suggesting, like an environmental index into Human Development Index, and what I'm trying to say here is that human life and the quality of human life, be educated, be healthy, but drink fresh water, don't be exposed to CO2, to floods, to natural disaster. I mean, this is also part of quality of life, and the poorest are those less able to mitigate and adapt are the ones who are going to get hit the worst, right? So it comes right into the whole sort of quality of life or human development approach. Okay. Okay, so I'm nearly done. So what I want to do is, this is the outcome document of the Open Working Group in the UN on Sustainable Development Goals that just came out in July. And what's interesting here is that in that document, unlike the SDSN's document that's live and being updated, they kept a goal on reduce inequality within and among countries. They actually kept it as a goal, a standalone goal 10, right? To me, they broke it into targets. Those that I think resonate to me about within nations inequality, and then there's targets to me that resonate about across nation inequality. So if we look at them just a little bit, so when we're thinking about how there's differences in household incomes or difference in income inequality across households within a country, it's just saying, well, we've got to look at policies that try and bring up lower incomes, fine, up to the national averages. Then this kind of Amartya Sen idea, the empowerment of households around their socioeconomic and political rights, irrespective of their demographic structure, etc. So that's very much about their ability to own. If you read that literature on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, second division rights, economic, social, political rights, you'll see it's all about access to assets, ownership of assets, no discrimination, particularly amongst women, gender, etc. So that feeds into that way of thinking. The same idea, the government has to play a role in this to make sure there's no discriminatory laws, restrictive practices, this sort of idea. And then finally, rather than redistribution of assets or ownership, rather than any sort of redistribution of assets policy, they kind of zone in on sort of a fiscal policy. This is tax and spend, social protection policies, etc., that try and achieve better equality. Okay, and this one to me is very interesting because, in all honesty, it actually can be good to have inequality, because it's actually good to have people in jobs with high incomes who are in insurance markets, because they're the ones who are actually willing to pay taxes, to pay into insurance products, etc. And that creates an opportunity for a government or for a public-private partnership to actually then provide funds that deal with equity issues, right? You can't deal with equity issues unless you're dealing with efficiency issues. And people get confused with this. So the ILO, there's a question coming up from one of the MDPs about, the social protection floors, that we need this, the ILO, this is the ILO policy, but who pays for that? Like, who pays for those floors? There has to be a society that's able to generate income, right, and tax that income, and then a redistributive policy, or has a policy in insurance products. And insurance products depend on people with different incomes, different risk aversions, different tastes, right? And then if you can deal with that, in other words, exploit these normal and natural inequalities to actually generate sort of these products, then to deal with equity and other types of issues. Okay. Now, clearly, if inequality arises because of direct discrimination, that is a problem. Or, I'm not saying that, right? But even with all these freedoms, there are companies that will do better. There are people who are better. They're able to generate more money, able to generate more. You will get, even with all these freedoms and get rid of all these restrictive practices, and even with a perfect government, you will naturally see inequality, right? The issue is it an outcome of just productivity and just better companies, better people, or is it an outcome of some form of discrimination or bad practices, etc.? So there is no doubt that within country, they're zoning in on these issues to do with freedoms around. They don't explicitly talk about assets, they don't explicitly, we can talk about this, but that seems to line up with the way we're thinking about what's generating inequality within nations. In terms of across nations, to me, this is a bit more lightweight, in the sense is that we know the institutions across nations are poor. So who's really in charge and regulating and understanding migration flows between nations and the implication they're having for income inequalities, for example, like remittances? Who's looking at that? Who's really looking at capital flows? Who's really looking at trade? I know there's the WTO, I know there's the IMF, I know these things, right? There's the UN, etc. But the reality is we're in a highly globalized world in terms of the flows of trade and the flows of people and capital, and we're in a situation where our global institutions are very weak, right? And in terms of, we know that it's these partnerships really have a big say, and these institutions can have a big say in the underlying sort of drivers of inequality in the world, but also within different countries. Like, we know this is true, right? Are the sort of targets and recommendations dealing with that? Well, in a way they say, global financial markets institutions need to be regulated. We know this after but it hasn't really happened, but we know this after the 2008 crisis. We have to more effective accountability, credibility, legitimacy. This is with the flow of money. Looking at this orderly, safe, regular, like looking at mobility of people, because that's feeding obviously into global inequality. This whole thing about trips, property rights, sort of gaming of export cartels all around the WTO, that has to be corrected. You need smarter people in there like you guys negotiating, representing the developing world, etc. ODA has to be smarter in this respect, etc. Right? So there is a sense that, you know, there are institutions need to be put in place to try and mitigate some of the issues that are happening that's generating inequality across nations. But I'm not sure the detail comes out there. They just kind of go, well, there's something with trade and migration flows that's not quite right, and we're not quite getting there, and we know this is generating quite a lot of inequality. Okay, final point. The SDSN document didn't have a goal, an explicit goal in inequality at all, right? And a question came up on the website saying, well, what are you saying about inequality? And there's an answer which I put up on the slides, which is saying, you know, inequality, relative, that's an outcome, right? So a lot of our goals and all of our suggestions are zoning in on the infrastructures and the freedoms and the discriminatory problems of individuals. And if you get them right, that will translate into, hopefully, better economic, social, environmental development, but also, you know, create a more fairer distribution of income as a result, okay? So the thing is, rather than being explicit as inequality as a goal, which is like at a nation state or a region or a globe, let's keep focused on the empowerment of individuals, right? And that's where our goal setting should be more focused, which will translate into better economic, social, and political, hopefully, development, okay? But there is no explicit goal in the SDN report on inequality. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Hopefully I was a little bit coherent, but are we going to close off to the rest? A few questions, maybe?
Yeah, about 10 minutes.
Oh yeah, 10 minutes, okay. So I take them off the dial, okay. Okay, so the most popular question of 17 likes, this is the article that I wrote about social protection beyond the bottom billion. We focus on transitory poverty, right? But how can that work for the always poor category? Okay. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So obviously, when somebody comes along and actually goes, look, you know, there are people in extreme poverty. There are a set of policies like transfers that we can use that we're used to helping people out of poverty. Because people seem to have a sense that people in extreme poverty are born into it. They're there forever. They're a demographic. You know who they are, and they're structurally in poverty. And the set of policies you need to get them out of there, you know, what sort of social transfers do you need? You know, how would you do this? Okay. The reality is that poverty is actually quite fluid. And then if you look at household surveys and you just ask them, you know, those at a point in time who are in extreme poverty, like, how long have you been in poverty? Right? A lot of them only say maybe 6 months. And then, are you always poor? And they kind of, no, I'm intermittently poor. And this can happen because of harvests, because of different things, right, that you just kind of drop in and out, okay? And then the issue becomes, you know, is there a way of looking at people who are sometimes poor? So rather than focusing on the bottom billion, let's focus on those who are sometimes poor, or everybody up to about 5.9 billion. And is there a way of giving them a tool that makes them less vulnerable to these episodes of poverty, to stop the inflow into poverty, rather than to focus on the outflow, right? And what we suggest is, rather than a social protection floor, the first thing you got to do is get your efficiency right. If there are a group of people who have a willingness to pay for insurance to mitigate their vulnerability to episodes like bad health episodes, like or environmental shocks or other types of shocks, that you should focus on that. And it's insurance, and it's basically self-paid for. People pay in, and if they have an event, they get a payment out. Okay, and it should be self-financed, and private companies are interested in this. Okay, so those type of funds, though, actually give you an opportunity, and for a government in particular, to start thinking about building social transfer mechanism around them, right? So when you have efficiency, you have more tax revenue, you've got a more social insurance fund, then you can start thinking about more social transfers or social protection floors, right? And what we're saying is that you can have Pareto optimality. By actually dealing with people who are sometimes poor, it doesn't make anybody else worse off, and it makes them better off. So why don't you do it? And it more than likely can make a government have a greater legitimacy and capacity to redistribute new social transfers. So we're not saying it's one or the other. We're actually saying they're separate issues, and you should do both. You should do both simultaneously. But we believe that by actually running a social protection, social insurance scheme in a nation, you build capacity of government, you build legitimacy, you have a greater ability to keep people and their assets in place, to generate tax revenue, and it just means the government can consider more social transfer products because they need financing. So it's all very fine to say that you want a social protection floor, but any social protection floor that the basics, the ILO say, that's normally 10% of GDP. 10% of GDP in GDP and PPP of the Southern Hemisphere is actually $3 trillion. Okay, overseas or foreign aid is only $130 billion. Okay, so it's, you know, who finances that? Who finances? And we believe what you got to do is you basically build the capacity of government on the social insurance products for those who are sometimes poor or never poor, and you use that to build up your social security funds, and then use that to start to deal with equity issues. Okay, that's our argument in that paper. But we actually think people should not relate, the equity and the efficiency issue are separate, actually, and that you shouldn't ignore the efficiency issue because it actually comes to haunt you. Because every time you're dealing with the equity issue, getting people out of poverty, another round of people having a natural disaster, or they're exposed to a disease, or there's a flood or something, and then suddenly you have a new body of people who've lost their assets coming in looking for social transfer. So if there's issues around vulnerability and resilience, deal with them. Why not? And also deal with the poor as well. Issues, yes. So this is the problem of measures. Okay, so this goes back to the data. Okay. Just go.
Click done first. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a question, seems to be a popular question around, and this is generally true. This is the issue around measurement of GDP per capita in general, or income-based measures, in the sense that what we're trying to do here is, do we actually have the data, or are we actually able to measure income inequality across households? Okay, so just to give a bit of a long answer, the reason why people use GDP per capita is that back in the old days, people didn't go into household data at all. They actually went into company data, right? So what they felt is that whatever about an exercise that takes a stratified sample of households and actually asks all those questions and basically you know, puts them all into digitalize them, wherever. In the old days, you couldn't really do that. So the best way people used to measure income in a region was actually the value of goods and services coming out of company accounts. Okay. Now, there's an exercise in Tanzania where, let's say you decide, when people looked at GDP per capita, there was a bit of an outcry in the Human Development Index that wasn't really measuring standards of living or average standards of living in a country. Shouldn't it be better to use expenditures, or to try and go into household data and to really understand what people were spending on, right? So income should equal expenditure. Were they buying health, education services, food, non-food products, etc.? And when people did this, what they realized was there actually quite a big disconnect between, say, GDP per capita, particularly when there's a lot of transfer pricing going on or exporting going on, in terms of the real sort of wealth or income that was coming into households versus the income generated by companies. Okay, and the way that was corrected is that people moved to GNI. They started to say, well, okay, maybe we want you know, not gross domestic product, gross national product. That kind of represents more the national, the home market, the value of goods and services sold on the home market. And that's more likely to trickle down into the households. But anybody who's actually done a Human Development Index with actually household data, consumption data, or expenditure data, realize that people's incomes are an awful lot lower than they would have anticipated using GNI or GMP. Okay, and this is, you know, the problem there is that, of course, then people look at GDP or companies and go, well, there's an awful lot of economic activity out there that's not recorded, that's not formal. So even if you think you're collecting values of goods and services from companies, you know, the informal sector maybe you're not. You're missing it completely, right? On the other hand, you know, the people who are doing work on the household surveys, who are taking, you know, representative samples, etc., they seem to be more accurate. I mean, they ask questions about, you know, is your job waged? Is it formal, informal employment, part-time? So you kind of get, from the household surveys, that you would get a much more accurate view of, say, the income coming across these representative households across different regions. Now you're counting on, you know, the stratified samples and the statisticians getting this right inside their countries, and that's always a problem. But let's say they can do a representative sample using household surveys, and to actually get at the income distributions is actually less problematic. Like the informal sector is a less problematic issue when you use household data versus if you use, say, company data, which is obviously only tracking the formal companies and the values goods from there. Okay, so that's, for me, then the way around the informal sector is to just make sure you're using the demographic surveys that are actually, you know, taking good samples of households, whether they're working, not working, informal, etc. Clearly.
It's the one on the screen.
Okay.
The one on blue you can answer, if you have time.
Okay. Okay, so this is a very good question. Okay, so this is, again, going back to my background as an industrial economist. Okay, somehow it seems to be the case that people are looking at multinational activity in Africa in particular, particularly around, say, gas, natural resources, etc., and they become very worried about the role of the private sector here. Okay, and the problem here is that we, as part of a quite aggressive industrial policy, the aim of a local government should be that it has to be capable of generating as much value added for the local or its society or the local community or the government as possible. So in Ireland, for example, even though we have very low corporation tax, maybe even zero to make sure the companies are there, we do have very aggressive laws in the sense that, look, these jobs have to be formal, you've got to pay social insurance, you know, the guys get wages, out of those wages we take taxes. So we're very clear from, we can get rents from waged income and from payments into the pension funds and into the social insurance. We know we can grab rents that way. The other thing we're very aggressive at is that we realize a lot of these companies need supports in terms of inputs and value chains. So a lot of the social media companies and pharmaceutical companies have backward linkages to a lot of medium to small companies in Ireland, because we basically have a highly educated force, a highly technical force, and we, through basically subcontracting and offering services as intermediates to the companies, we're able to extract quite a lot of rent and money that way, etc. And also we have very aggressive legislation around environmental, labor laws. We're a highly unionized society, etc. Right? So what it kind of means is that this sort of idea that some foreign company comes in, uses child labor, destroys our environment, doesn't pay any taxes, doesn't really pay properly, takes all the scarcity rent and runs, we don't allow that, because we have a government that has, in what we call investment criteria rule, what companies do we bring into our business parks, do we support with our tax incentives. We would do quite a big scoping exercise about how much of that money would feed and trickle down into the local and domestic economy and into the government and taxes. And this is exactly what Africa needs. It needs a bureaucratic structure, not necessarily a parliamentary system, but it needs civil servants and these guys who are capable, these the MDP students will be doing this, capable of taking on the multinational and saying, well, this is our industrial policy, you can only locate in our countries under this investment criteria, this is how we extract the rents from these countries. They're not necessarily direct through taxation, but maybe indirect through linkages and through other features. And unfortunately, these institutions are weak. But so, like, I've emphasized that institutions of antitrust across nations and regulation are very weak. But unfortunately, within nation, this sort of idea of regulation and competition law and antitrust law is also quite weak. And industrial policy can be quite weak in terms of the selection and the investment criteria of attracting what type of multinationals into what type of activity, what type of region and zone. Because if you were clever, you would get quite a lot of out of that instead of maybe what's happening. Okay. Is there another question?
I don't think we have time.
We have no time. Okay. So again, I can see the people in the room here. Unfortunately, I can't see people around the world, but I look forward to meeting some of the directors at the conference next week. And just to say about the Global MDP Association, we are self-governed in that it's the kind of the directors of the MDP who run the association at the moment. But in the near future, it will be the students and the alumni who will run this association, and we are building the structures to do that. And hopefully I'll meet a good few of the students, particularly from North America and Europe next week. But we will be building linkages, so you will hear from me again. And thank you for your patience today, and I'm going to sign off. And we look forward to the lecture next week. So we have Jeffrey Sachs, right, hopefully, on the MDGs. So thank you for your patience and listening. So I'm going to sign off.